In this emotional story, Madison Harper, a young girl, is arrested for simply drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. Her father, David, launches a relentless fight for justice, determined to hold the local police accountable. As the town becomes divided, tensions grow, and the struggle for change becomes a powerful battle between neighbors, authority, and the truth. How will David's fight impact the community, and will Madison ever feel safe again? Stick around to see how this gripping story unfolds. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Let's dive in. It was one of those perfect summer days when the sun bathed everything in golden light, and the air was filled with the soft hum of distant lawnmowers and the chirping of birds. The kind of day that Madison Harper, a bright and curious 9-year-old, loved. The neighborhood was quiet, but not eerily so. Just the kind of peaceful suburban street where families felt safe letting their children play outside. The world was full of color and possibilities for Madison, especially when she had her box of chalk in hand. Madison knelt on the sidewalk in front of her family's modest but well-kept house, her knees slightly scuffed from her earlier adventure, climbing a tree in the yard. She didn't mind. Her focus now was on the intricate mural she was creating on the pavement, a bright, sprawling scene of rainbows, smiling animals, and the biggest, happiest sun she could imagine. The sun had rosy cheeks, and Madison took extra care in shading the rays so they stretched out across the street in wide yellow arcs. A breeze rustled the leaves in the trees overhead, and for a moment, Madison paused to soak it all in. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the feeling of freedom that came with being able to create whatever she wanted. She loved to draw, especially outside where her imagination had no boundaries. It was like painting on the canvas of the world itself. Her parents, David and Jessica Harper, had always encouraged her artistic spirit. David was the town's mayor, a respected figure known for his dedication to the community, and Jessica worked at the local elementary school, always supportive of the arts. They never minded that Madison spent her afternoons turning the sidewalk into a gallery of her colorful creations. They believed in letting their daughter explore her creativity, knowing how much joy it brought her. From inside the house, Jessica occasionally peeked out of the window, smiling to herself as she saw her daughter completely absorbed in her drawings. The front door was open, and the breeze carried the smell of freshly baked cookies from the kitchen. Jessica was getting them ready for when Madison finally came inside, sticky with chalk dust and eager to share her latest masterpiece. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, there were a few families that took less of an interest in such creativity. Directly across the street lived Evelyn Morgan, an older woman who seemed to pride herself on keeping her lawn perfectly manicured and her hedges trimmed just right. To Evelyn, Madison's sidewalk art was more of an eyesore than a display of innocence. She wasn't one to speak to the Harpers directly about it, but she kept a close eye on the neighborhood from behind her lace curtains, her expression often pinched with disapproval. Madison, however, paid no mind to such things. She was far too focused on adding tiny bluebirds to her sky. Her chalk creations brought her happiness, and that was all that mattered. "Almost done," she whispered to herself, adjusting the shade of blue on one bird's wings. Her animals looked happy, her sun beamed down on them, and the flowers she'd drawn were in full bloom, their petals open wide. It was, to her, the perfect scene. She smiled to herself, completely unaware of the shadow that was soon to fall over her innocent world. Madison was so engrossed in her artwork that she didn't hear the rumble of an engine approaching from down the street. The rhythmic crunch of gravel under heavy tires signaled the arrival of a patrol car, but it blended into the background noise of the afternoon. Even as the car slowed to a stop a few feet behind her, Madison remained oblivious, completely absorbed in adding the final details to her son's face. Officer Brian Cole climbed out of the police cruiser, the door slamming shut behind him. His uniform was crisp and his posture rigid, the mark of a man who believed in law and order, with little patience for those who didn't. He had been patrolling the neighborhood after receiving a call about a potential disturbance, someone marking up public property. He wasn't the type to overlook even the smallest infractions. From across the street, Evelyn Morgan watched from her porch, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her lips as Officer Cole strode toward Madison. To her, this was long overdue. She had been watching Madison's sidewalk drawings for days, each time growing more irritated at the colorful mess she believed was bringing down the look of the neighborhood. "Hey!" Officer Cole's voice cut through the air like a whip, sharp and commanding. Madison jumped at the sound, her piece of yellow chalk slipping from her fingers and rolling across the pavement. She spun around, her wide eyes landing on the tall figure of the officer towering over her. His face was set in a deep frown, his brows furrowed as he surveyed the brightly colored drawings spread across the sidewalk. Madison blinked up at him, confusion quickly replacing the calm happiness she had felt just moments ago. "Hi, officer," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. She stood up, brushing the chalk dust off her shorts. "Is something wrong?" Officer Cole stepped closer, his boots making a heavy thud against the pavement. He looked down at the chalk mural with a mixture of disdain and irritation, as though the cheerful drawings were a personal offense. He didn't see a child's innocent artwork. He saw vandalism. "You can't be doing this here," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. He pointed at the sidewalk with a stiff gesture. "This isn't your property, it's public property, and you can't go around marking it up." Madison's face crumpled in confusion. She looked down at her drawings, then back up at the officer. "But I wasn't doing anything bad," she said, her voice small and unsure. "It's just chalk. It'll wash away when it rains." Officer Cole didn't soften. His expression remained hard, and he shook his head as though Madison's explanation didn't matter. "That's not the point," he said, his voice cold. "You're marking up public property without permission. That's against the rules." Madison's heart started to pound faster, the fear creeping in. She had always thought the police were there to help people, but this didn't feel like help. This felt wrong. "I didn't know," she stammered, her eyes welling up with tears. "I thought it was okay. I wasn't hurting anything." Just as she was about to say more, the front door of the house across the street swung open, and Evelyn Morgan stepped out onto her porch. Her lips curled into a self-satisfied smile as she crossed her arms over her chest, watching the scene unfold like it was something she had been waiting for. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying a note of triumph. She glanced at Madison, her expression cold and dismissive. "I've been telling them for days that this child has been marking up the street with her chalk. It's a mess, and it's about time someone put a stop to it." Madison's heart sank. She could feel the tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as she looked from Evelyn to the officer, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. "But I'm just drawing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just a picture. I can clean it up." Evelyn waved a dismissive hand in the air. "It doesn't matter what it is," she said sharply. "This isn't a playground, and it's not a place for children to be marking up the street. This kind of behavior brings down the whole neighborhood." Officer Cole's frown deepened. He looked back at Madison, the weight of his authority bearing down on her like a cloud. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his tone final. Madison's breath caught in her throat. "No!" she cried, stepping back in panic. "Please, I'll stop. I'll clean it up. My dad's inside. You can ask him." But Officer Cole wasn't interested in listening. Without another word, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unrelenting. Madison's small body trembled as he pulled her toward the police cruiser, her heart racing in her chest. The tears that had been building finally spilled over, streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to keep her balance. "I didn't do anything wrong," she sobbed, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, don't take me away." But Officer Cole didn't respond. With a practiced motion, he reached for his handcuffs and clicked them around Madison's small wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin, too big for her tiny frame. Madison stared at the cuffs in disbelief, her chest tightening with fear. This couldn't be happening. It was just chalk. How could something so small turn into something so terrifying? Officer Cole opened the back door of the squad car and pushed Madison inside, her legs shaking as she stumbled onto the seat. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, sealing her inside. Madison pressed her tear-streaked face against the window, watching as the world outside grew smaller. Her bright chalk drawings, the flowers, the animals, the big smiling sun, faded into the distance as the car pulled away from her home. Everything she had spent the afternoon creating was left behind, just like her. Inside the squad car, Madison's sobs came in quiet, shuddering waves. Her small body shook as she tried to wipe her tears with her cuffed hands, the cold metal of the cuffs clinking together with every movement. She had never been so scared in her life. Her heart pounded in her chest and her mind raced with confusion. What had she done wrong? It was just chalk. It would wash away with the rain, like it always did. The world outside the window blurred as the police car sped through the neighborhood. The streets she had played on, the sidewalks where she had spent so many afternoons drawing, now seemed foreign to her. She didn't feel safe anymore. How could everything go so wrong so fast? Officer Cole glanced in the rearview mirror, his face still set in a hard, unreadable expression. To him, this was just another routine arrest. He didn't see the small, frightened girl in the back seat. He saw a problem, a rule breaker, someone who needed to be taught a lesson. And he wasn't about to let sympathy get in the way of doing his job. "Quiet down back there," he barked, his voice sharp and impatient. Madison flinched, trying to stifle her sobs. She curled into herself, her cuffed hands trembling in her lap. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong." But Officer Cole wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He had a job to do, and to him, rules were rules. It didn't matter if it was chalk or paint or something else entirely. Defacing public property was a crime, and crimes had consequences. Madison's tears kept falling, her face hot with confusion and fear. "It was just a drawing," she said again, her voice trembling. "I wasn't hurting anyone." The car pulled into the parking lot of the police station, its gray brick walls looming ahead like something out of a nightmare. Madison's stomach twisted into knots as they came to a stop. She had never been anywhere like this before. It looked so cold, so unfriendly. Police stations were supposed to be places where people went to get help, but now all she felt was fear. Officer Cole got out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He opened the back door and grabbed Madison by the arm, pulling her out. She stumbled slightly, the weight of the cuffs making it hard to keep her balance. Her wrists ached where the metal bit into her skin, and her legs felt like jelly beneath her. The fluorescent lights inside the police station were harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows against the walls. The air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant, and everything felt cold, emotionless. Madison looked around, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Nothing about this place felt safe. Officer Cole marched her down a long hallway, his grip on her arm firm. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and Madison's heart raced faster with each step. She didn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't anyone stopping this? Why wasn't anyone helping her? "We're going to process you for vandalism," Officer Cole said flatly, as if this were the most routine thing in the world. Vandalism? The word didn't even make sense to Madison. She was just drawing with chalk. How could that be vandalism? Her chest tightened with panic and the tears started again. "Please, I didn't mean to," she whispered, but her words trailed off into nothing. They entered a small room where another officer, Officer Stevens, was sitting behind a desk, flipping through paperwork. He looked up as they entered, his brow furrowing slightly when he saw Madison standing there, handcuffed and trembling. "What's the story here?" Officer Stevens asked, his tone one of confusion as he glanced from Officer Cole to Madison and back again. "Caught her marking up the street with chalk," Officer Cole said, his voice full of authority. "Public property, no permission." Officer Stevens raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Chalk?" he repeated, his eyes flicking back to Madison. "She's just a kid." Officer Cole didn't flinch. "Rules are rules," he said curtly. "Doesn't matter if it's chalk or paint. The law's the law." Before Officer Stevens could respond, the door to the station burst open with a loud bang. A voice boomed through the room, filled with anger and disbelief. "Where is she?" Madison's head snapped toward the door, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was her father, David Harper, his face a mask of fury. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an overwhelming rage that filled the room. "I want to know why my daughter is sitting in this station in handcuffs," David demanded, his voice echoing through the room. Officer Cole straightened up, his grip still firm on Madison's arm. "Sir, this girl was caught vandalizing public property," he began, his voice still full of authority. "We had a call." David cut him off, stepping closer, his body radiating with anger. She's 9 years old, he snapped, his voice rising. She was drawing with chalk. This is ridiculous. Officer Cole didn't back down. Sir, rules are rules. She was defacing public property. We don't make exceptions just because she's a kid. David's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with barely controlled fury. He looked down at his daughter, her face streaked with tears, her small wrists cuffed together. The sight made his blood boil. You handcuffed my daughter, David said slowly, his voice dangerously low. For drawing with chalk? The room fell silent as the tension thickened, the weight of David's words hanging in the air, like a storm about to break. David Harper was not a man easily rattled. As the mayor of the town, he had dealt with crises, political challenges, and difficult people. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the sight of his daughter, his little girl, standing in a police station with handcuffs around her wrists, tears streaming down her face. He hadn't known when he got the call just how serious things had become. The officer on the phone had been vague, only mentioning that there had been an incident involving Madison and that she was at the station. But now, standing there and seeing his daughter in this state, all of his instincts as a father overrode his calm, diplomatic nature. David's eyes narrowed as he locked onto Officer Cole, the man responsible for this nightmare. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed, if only for Madison's sake. Take the cuffs off her. Now, David said, his voice barely above a growl. Officer Cole hesitated, glancing at the other officers in the room. For a moment, it looked like he was going to argue, but the fierce determination in David's eyes left no room for debate. Reluctantly, Cole pulled out his keys and unlocked the cuffs, letting them fall from Madison's wrists with a soft clink. The moment the cuffs were off, Madison ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his coat. Her body shook with quiet sobs, and David knelt down, hugging her tightly. It's okay, baby, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It's okay. I'm here. For a moment, David closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He could feel the rage simmering beneath the surface, but he knew he needed to keep it in check for now. He wasn't done with Officer Cole, not by a long shot, but right now his priority was Madison. He stood up, keeping one arm around his daughter, and turned back to the officers. This is unacceptable, he said, his voice low but filled with authority. I don't care what the rules are. Arresting a child for drawing on the sidewalk is not something I'm going to stand for. Officer Cole stiffened. Sir, it's the law. Defacing public property. Chalk, David cut him off, his eyes blazing. She was using chalk. You handcuffed a 9-year-old for something that washes away with water. Before the argument could escalate further, another officer stepped forward. Captain Rebecca Nelson, the station's commanding officer. She had been alerted to the situation and knew this wasn't something that could be handled the usual way. Not with David Harper, the mayor, standing in the middle of her station, furious over the arrest of his child. Mr. Harper, Captain Nelson said calmly, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. Why don't we step into my office and discuss this privately? David glanced at her, his jaw clenched. He didn't trust any of them right now, but he knew he needed to get Madison out of the immediate chaos. Reluctantly, he nodded. Fine, he said, his voice tight. But this isn't over. With that, he scooped Madison up into his arms and followed Captain Nelson into her office, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in the air. Inside Captain Nelson's office, the tension was palpable. David sat across from the captain, still holding Madison close, his heart still pounding with anger and disbelief. Madison's sobs had quieted, but she clung to her father, her face hidden against his chest. Captain Nelson sat behind her desk, her expression serious but measured. She knew how delicate this situation was, and the last thing she wanted was to make it worse. But there was no escaping the fact that this had been a massive error in judgment, and now they were going to have to deal with the fallout. Mr. Harper, Captain Nelson began carefully, her voice professional but not without empathy. I understand that this situation is deeply upsetting, and I want to apologize on behalf of the department for how things have unfolded. David's eyes flashed with anger. Upsetting doesn't even begin to cover it, he said, his voice cold. My daughter was arrested for drawing with chalk, handcuffed, treated like a criminal. How does that happen? Captain Nelson sighed, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. I've reviewed the situation, and I agree that Officer Cole's handling of the matter was inappropriate, she said. He was following protocol, but I believe there's room for discretion, especially when it comes to children. David shook his head, incredulous. Following protocol? Is that your excuse? A child was arrested for something that wasn't even permanent. Chalk! And you're telling me that's protocol? Captain Nelson met his gaze, her expression firm but understanding. What Officer Cole did may have been technically within the bounds of the law, she said. But I'm not here to defend his actions. I'm here to make things right. I assure you, this will be addressed. David's jaw tightened, and he glanced down at Madison, who had calmed, but still hadn't said a word. He brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his heart aching for what she had gone through. He couldn't let this go, not just for her, but for every child who might face something like this in the future. What I want, David said, his voice low and controlled, is for this to never happen again. Not to my daughter, not to anyone's child. Captain Nelson nodded. I understand, and I agree. I'll be reviewing our department's protocols, especially when it comes to handling incidents involving minors. Officer Cole's actions will be investigated, and if disciplinary measures are warranted, they will be taken. David didn't respond right away. He didn't know if he could trust her words. But what choice did he have at this moment? For now, all he could do was take Madison home and try to comfort her. The real fight would come later. Fine, he said at last, standing up with Madison still in his arms. But know this, I'm not letting this go. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened here, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again. Captain Nelson stood as well, her expression serious. I understand, Mr. Harper, and I'll do everything I can to ensure that the situation is addressed appropriately. David nodded curtly, then turned and left the office. Madison's arms wrapped tightly around his neck. As they walked out of the station and into the warm afternoon air, David's mind raced with everything that had happened. The chalk drawings, the arrest, the handcuffs. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. As they got into the car, Madison finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Daddy, she whispered, am I in trouble? David's heart broke at the question. He turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Not at all. Madison blinked up at him, her wide eyes still filled with confusion. But the policeman, he said I broke the rules. David's jaw tightened, his anger simmering beneath the surface once again. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm for her sake. What he did was wrong, he said softly, and I'm going to make sure that never happens to you again. Madison nodded slowly, but the fear in her eyes lingered. David could see it, and it tore him apart. She shouldn't have had to experience something like this. No child should. As they drove home, David's thoughts shifted from anger to determination. This wasn't just about Madison anymore. This was about the kind of world they were living in, and the kind of world he wanted to build, for his daughter and for every other child in the community. And he wasn't going to stop until he made it right. The car ride home from the police station was quiet, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. Madison sat in the back seat, staring out of the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since they left the station, her face still tear-streaked and her small body visibly tense. David Harper kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his heart aching every time he saw the confused, hurt expression on his daughter's face. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. Rage, guilt, disbelief. How could something so innocent, something as simple as drawing with chalk, turn into such a nightmare? The moment they pulled into the driveway, Jessica Harper rushed out of the house. She had been waiting anxiously ever since David's brief, tense phone call telling her what had happened. As soon as she saw Madison's pale face and red, puffy eyes, Jessica's heart broke. Madison, Jessica called softly, kneeling down as David opened the car door. Madison slid out slowly, her shoulders slumped, and walked into her mother's open arms. Oh, baby, Jessica whispered, hugging her tightly, stroking her hair. "Are you okay?" Madison nodded weakly, but the hollow look in her eyes said otherwise. She didn't speak, just buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Jessica exchanged a worried look with David, who simply shook his head, his own face a mask of anger and frustration. David clenched his jaw as he watched his daughter cling to her mother. This shouldn't have happened. His sweet, innocent daughter had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been treated like a criminal. As they went inside, Madison moved like a shadow of herself, quiet, withdrawn, and distant. Later that evening, after Madison had gone to bed, David sat at the kitchen table, his mind still spinning. He knew that this was just the beginning. He couldn't let what had happened today go unchallenged. The system that allowed this kind of injustice had to be held accountable, not just for Madison, but for every child who might find themselves in a similar situation. Jessica joined him, sitting down with a cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes were filled with concern as she glanced toward the hallway where Madison's bedroom door remained slightly ajar. "She's so quiet," Jessica said softly. "She hasn't said much since she got home." David nodded, his expression grim. "She's scared," he said. "Confused, and I don't blame her. What they did to her, it was wrong, Jess. I'm going to make sure that this doesn't just get swept under the rug." Jessica reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "What are you going to do?" David's eyes hardened. "I'm going to make sure Officer Cole is held accountable. I'll take this as far as I need to. He can't just get away with this." Jessica sighed, her grip on his arm tightening. "I just want Madison to be okay," she whispered. "She's our little girl, and she shouldn't have to deal with something like this." David's heart ached as he thought about the impact the incident had already had on Madison. She had always been so bright, so full of life and creativity. Seeing her like this, so quiet, so unsure of herself, was unbearable. He knew the emotional toll was far from over. "I know," David said, his voice softening as he looked at his wife, "but I promise you, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." For her, Jessica nodded, though the worry didn't leave her eyes. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for Madison's sake, they would face it together. The next morning, David woke up determined. He spent the early hours making phone calls, first to the city's legal department, then to community leaders and other parents he knew. He wasn't going to let Officer Cole's actions go unnoticed. The more people knew about what had happened to Madison, the harder it would be for the system to cover it up. Meanwhile, Madison stayed inside, quiet and withdrawn. Normally, she would have been outside by now, working on another chalk drawing or riding her bike up and down the street. But today she sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her, but her hands still. The joy she usually felt when drawing was missing, replaced by a lingering sense of fear and uncertainty. Jessica sat across from her, watching her daughter carefully. She wanted to say something, to help Madison understand that she hadn't done anything wrong, but she wasn't sure how. Instead, she gently encouraged her to draw, hoping it would help. "Do you want to make another picture, sweetheart?" Jessica asked softly. "Maybe something with a rainbow?" Madison didn't look up. She just shook her head, her small fingers idly tracing the edges of the blank page. David's focus, meanwhile, was on the growing storm in the neighborhood. News of Madison's arrest had already spread, and opinions were divided. Some people, particularly families with young children, were horrified by what had happened and voiced their support for David's push for accountability. But others, led by the ever-watchful Evelyn Morgan, believed that Madison's arrest was justified. In their eyes, rules were rules, and breaking them, no matter how small the infraction, warranted consequences. Evelyn had been more vocal than anyone, telling anyone who would listen that Madison's chalk drawings were a blight on the neighborhood. She insisted that the arrest was necessary to maintain order and that the Harpers were overreacting. David had heard enough of her self-righteousness to last a lifetime. He had no interest in sparring with his neighbor, but it was clear that Evelyn's words were influencing some of the more conservative families in the area. The neighborhood, once peaceful and united, was now showing cracks. By mid-morning, David had arranged a meeting with several key figures in the community, including Reverend Lewis, the pastor at the local church, and Sandra Wacth, the president of the PTA. They had always been strong advocates for children's rights, and David knew he could count on their support. The meeting was held at the community center, and as David walked in, he was greeted by nods of sympathy and concern. Reverend Lewis, a tall man with a gentle demeanor, approached him with a solemn expression. "David," the Reverend said, shaking his hand firmly, "I heard about what happened to Madison. I'm so sorry. How is she holding up?" David sighed, the weight of his emotions heavy on his shoulders. "She's shaken up. She doesn't understand why this happened to her. I'm trying to explain, but it's hard." Reverend Lewis nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's unacceptable. No child should go through what she went through. That officer needs to be held accountable." "That's why I'm here," David said, his voice firm. "I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. I need the community's support. If we don't stand up now, this kind of thing will keep happening. To Madison, to other kids. We can't let that happen." Sandra Wacth, who had been listening quietly from the side, stepped forward. "You have my full support, David," she said, her voice strong. "As a parent, I can't even imagine what you and Jessica are going through. But this is bigger than just one family. We need to make sure the police know that the community won't tolerate this." The meeting continued, and David felt a renewed sense of purpose as more and more people voiced their support. Together, they began planning how to raise awareness, from organizing town hall meetings to contacting local media. This wasn't just about Madison. It was about standing up against an unjust system. But even as the meeting ended, David knew that not everyone in the community would be on his side. Evelyn Morgan's influence still lingered, and there were others who, like her, believed in strict adherence to the rules, no matter how unfair or unjust those rules might be. As David left the community center, he couldn't help but glance down the street, where Evelyn's house sat, pristine and perfect. He knew she was watching. She always was. And he knew that the fight ahead wouldn't just be with the police. It would be with the very fabric of the neighborhood itself. Later that week, as David's campaign to hold Officer Cole accountable gained traction, the pushback began. It started subtly at first. Disapproving looks from neighbors as David walked Madison to school, whispers behind his back in the grocery store. But soon it escalated. David had filed a formal complaint with the police department, requesting an internal investigation into Officer Cole's actions. He had also reached out to local journalists, hoping to draw attention to the incident and apply pressure on the department to act. The story was starting to gain traction in the media, and soon people all over town were talking about Madison's arrest. But the police department wasn't backing down. Instead of admitting fault, they doubled down on their defense of Officer Cole, insisting that he had acted according to protocol and that Madison's arrest had been justified under the circumstances. David's frustration grew as he read the official statements coming from the department. They refused to acknowledge that a mistake had been made. Instead, they treated the incident as if it were a routine matter, something that could be brushed aside. Even more infuriating was the response from the police union. They issued a statement condemning the attacks on law enforcement and accusing David of using his position as mayor to undermine public trust in the police. It was a blatant attempt to paint David as the villain, and it worked, at least for some. One morning, as David was leaving the house to head to a city council meeting, he found a note taped to his front door. It was a single piece of paper, but the message was clear. "Stop causing trouble. We support our police. Keep your kid in line." David's blood boiled as he crumpled the note in his fist. He knew there were people in the community who felt this way, but seeing it in writing, knowing that someone had gone out of their way to threaten his family, it was infuriating. Jessica found him standing by the door, the note still clenched in his hand. "David," she asked softly, "what's wrong?" David showed her the note, his jaw tight with anger. "They're trying to intimidate us." Jessica's face paled as she read the note, and she instinctively glanced toward Madison's room. "What do we do?" David took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew that backing down now would send the wrong message, to his family, to Madison, and to the community. But he also knew that the stakes were getting higher. "We keep fighting," David said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm not going to let them scare us into silence." But as he walked out the door that day, David couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was only going to get more difficult. The system was resisting change, and the people who benefited from that system were starting to push back harder. That evening, after another long day of meetings and phone calls, David sat with Madison in the living room. She was curled up on the couch watching one of her favorite cartoons, but her usual spark of joy wasn't there. Her hands rested on the notebook in her lap, but she hadn't opened it once. "Madison," David said softly, sitting beside her. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Madison shrugged, her eyes still on the TV. "I don't know," she said quietly. David's heart ached for her. He wanted so badly to take away her fear, to bring back the joy that had been stolen from her. But he knew that the road to healing would be long. "You know you didn't do anything wrong, right?" David asked gently. "What happened? It wasn't your fault." Madison looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "But the policeman said I broke the rules," she whispered. "He said I wasn't supposed to draw on the street." David sighed, his chest tight. "He was wrong," he said firmly. "You didn't break any rules, Madison. You were just being yourself. And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows that." Madison nodded slowly, but David could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. He knew that it would take time for her to fully understand, to trust again, but he would be there for her every step of the way. As the weeks went on, the divide in the community deepened. David's fight to hold Officer Cole accountable was gaining more attention, but so was the resistance from those who believed in strict adherence to the law, no matter the cost. Protests erupted outside of City Hall, some in support of David and his efforts, others in support of the police department. What had once been a peaceful, tight-knit community was now fractured, with neighbors on opposite sides of the issue glaring at each other with distrust. One Saturday afternoon, David stood in front of City Hall, addressing a crowd of supporters. Parents, teachers, and community leaders had gathered to show their solidarity, holding signs that read "Justice for Madison" and "Stop Police Abuse." David stood at the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he spoke to the crowd. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said. "This is about all of our children. This is about standing up against a system that criminalizes innocence, that treats our kids like threats. We cannot let this stand." The crowd cheered in response, their energy filling the air. But just beyond the line of supporters, another group had gathered, pro-police protesters holding signs that read, "Support our officers and law and order for all." Among them was Evelyn Morgan, standing with her arms crossed, her face set in a hard frown. The two groups faced each other, tension rising with every passing minute. Shouts erupted from both sides, and it wasn't long before the police were called in to keep the peace. David watched from the podium, his heart heavy. This wasn't what he wanted. He had never intended for the fight for justice to turn into a battle between neighbors, but that was exactly what was happening. As the police officers arrived, David caught sight of Officer Cole, standing among them, his face unreadable. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and David's anger flared again. This was the man who had put his daughter in handcuffs, who had started this entire mess. And now he was being treated like a hero by those who refused to see the injustice in what he had done. David stepped down from the podium, making his way through the crowd. He had to talk to Cole. He had to confront him. But before David could reach him, a voice called out behind him, "David, wait!" David turned to see Reverend Lewis hurrying toward him, his face filled with concern. "Don't do it," the Reverend said, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Confronting him like this, it won't help." David clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "He needs to be held accountable," he said through gritted teeth. "He can't just stand there like nothing happened." "I know," Reverend Lewis said gently, "but there's a time and a place for that. This isn't it." David looked back at Officer Cole, his blood boiling, but he knew the Reverend was right. Confronting Cole in the middle of the protest would only make things worse. With a heavy sigh, David nodded. "You're right," he said, "but this isn't over." Reverend Lewis nodded in agreement. "It's far from over, but we'll face it together." As the protest continued, David's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for the soul of the community. The growing tension in the community finally came to a head one evening as David stood outside his house, staring down the street at Evelyn Morgan's pristine lawn. He hadn't planned on confronting her, but after weeks of passive-aggressive notes, glares, and whispered complaints, he had reached his breaking point. The sun had set, and the street was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Most of the neighbors had retreated indoors, but David couldn't shake the anger that had been building inside him. He knew that Evelyn had been one of the loudest voices in the opposition, spreading lies and stirring up resentment against him and his family. He had to confront her. He had to understand why she had called the police in the first place, why she had thought it was acceptable to turn an innocent child's afternoon into a nightmare. Before he knew it, David was walking down the sidewalk, his steps quick and purposeful. He could see the faint glow of a light in Evelyn's living room window, and as he approached, he felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. David knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was no response, but then the door swung open, revealing Evelyn, her expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "David," she said, her tone clipped. "What are you doing here?" David took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. Evelyn frowned, crossing her arms over her chest. "About what?" "About what you did," David said, his voice rising slightly. "About why you called the police on my daughter." Evelyn's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "I called because she was defacing public property," she said matter-of-factly. "It doesn't matter if it was chalk. The rules are the rules." David's blood boiled. "She's 9 years old," he snapped. "She wasn't defacing anything. She was drawing with chalk. It would have washed away with the rain." Evelyn shook her head, her mouth set in a thin line. "That's not the point, David. We have standards in this neighborhood, and if we let people break the rules whenever they want, where does it end?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So you think calling the police on a child was the right thing to do?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "You think putting her in handcuffs was justified?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing away for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I didn't know they would arrest her," she said quietly, "but I still think the rules need to be enforced." David stared at her, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You didn't even bother to talk to her," he said, his voice low. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't try to understand. You just assumed the worst, and now my daughter's afraid to go outside because of you." Evelyn's face paled, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. She looked down at her feet, her arms dropping to her sides. "I didn't mean for her to get hurt," she muttered, barely audible. David shook his head, his heart heavy with frustration. "Well, she did," he said, "and now you need to live with that." Without another word, David turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing in her doorway, her face drained of its usual self-righteousness. As he made his way back to his house, David felt a strange sense of release. He had said what he needed to say. The confrontation hadn't solved anything, but at least Evelyn understood now. At least she knew that her actions had consequences. But even as David walked away, he knew that the fight for justice was far from over. The confrontation with Evelyn Morgan hadn't gone as David had hoped, but it had given him a grim sense of clarity. He realized that changing Evelyn's mind, or even getting her to admit that what she did was wrong, wouldn't be enough. This battle wasn't just against a single neighbor. It was against a system that had allowed something so absurd, so cruel, to happen to his daughter. He knew he couldn't stop until he saw real change. The next morning, David stood by the kitchen counter, staring out of the window at the quiet street. His mind buzzed with plans, strategies, and the heavy weight of the responsibilities ahead. The kitchen was still, save for the faint sound of Jessica and Madison talking softly in the living room. Jessica entered the kitchen, her face still clouded with worry. "David," she said gently, "what are you going to do now? I know this is hard, but is taking on the police department going to help Madison?" David turned to her, his eyes determined. "I have to do this, Jess. I can't let Officer Cole or the entire system get away with this. Madison might be afraid now, but what about other kids? What if the next time it's worse? I need to know that this won't happen again." Jessica sighed, leaning against the counter. "I just don't want it to consume you. We need to help Madison heal too. She's still struggling." David's expression softened at the mention of his daughter. He knew Jessica was right, but the fight for justice wasn't something he could walk away from. "We'll help her," David said firmly, his voice low. But we can't let what happened to her just disappear into some bureaucratic black hole. Jessica nodded, though the tension in her face remained. I know. Just promise me you won't lose sight of what really matters. David reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I won't, he promised, though in his heart, he knew the road ahead would only get tougher. Later that day, David called a meeting with several key community members. The fight for justice was becoming larger than he had anticipated. What had started as a personal crusade for his daughter had evolved into a broader movement. Parents were outraged, teachers were speaking out, and community leaders were growing restless. Reverend Lewis and Sandra Wacth, the PTA president, had helped gather a group of concerned parents, activists, and local journalists at the community center. David arrived early, his mind racing as he prepared to make his case once again. As the meeting room filled with people, David felt a surge of hope. The crowd wasn't just full of supporters. There were people here ready to act. Reverend Lewis opened the meeting with a brief prayer, asking for guidance and strength. Afterward, David stepped to the front of the room, clearing his throat as he addressed the group. Thank you all for coming, David began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. As you know, my daughter Madison was arrested for drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. Since that day, I've been fighting to hold Officer Cole accountable. But this isn't just about Madison anymore. This is about every child in our community. It's about ensuring that the people sworn to protect us actually protect our children. There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and David pressed on. The police department claims Officer Cole was just following protocol, but we know that's not good enough. No child should be treated the way my daughter was. We need to demand real changes. We need better training, better oversight, and officers who understand that kids aren't criminals. Sandra Wacth stood up, her voice ringing out clearly. David's right. We've seen this pattern before. Children of color being treated unfairly, being treated like threats, even when they're just being kids. We can't sit back and let this happen again. A ripple of agreement passed through the room, and David could feel the momentum building. But he knew there would be resistance. The police department had already closed ranks around Officer Cole, and the pro-police voices in the community were growing louder. If they were going to win this battle, they needed to be smart, strategic, and relentless. I've filed an official complaint, David continued, but the police department isn't budging. We need to put pressure on them, and that starts with us coming together and making our voices heard. If they won't listen to us through official channels, we'll take this to the public. We'll organize protests, rallies, whatever it takes. The energy in the room shifted, the resolve strengthening. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the start of a movement. While David was busy organizing, Jessica focused on Madison. The change in their daughter was painful to witness. Madison, once a bubbly and creative child who spent hours outside drawing, had become withdrawn. The bright light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet fear that hadn't been there before. She refused to go outside, even when Jessica suggested they go to the park or visit a friend. Madison would just shake her head and retreat to her room, clutching her notebook close to her chest but rarely opening it. Jessica knew she had to approach the situation delicately. Madison was struggling to process what had happened, and forcing her to confront her fear too soon could make things worse. But Jessica also knew that they couldn't let Madison hide away forever. One afternoon, Jessica decided to take a gentle approach. She sat on the floor of Madison's room, quietly watching as her daughter fiddled with her colored pencils but didn't draw. The room was filled with the soft hum of a fan, and outside the summer breeze rustled the trees.